My name is Claire Mitchell. I am 36 years old and I spent $30,000 to build my sister's perfect wedding. But when the lights dimmed and my father lifted the microphone, every word he spoke erased me. My mother's laugh cut deeper than the glass that shattered in my hand, and 200 guests watched as I disappeared. What none of them knew was that the necklace around Emily's neck was never hers, and that night's humiliation was only the beginning. I stepped into the Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs, and for a moment, I almost forgot how much it had cost me to stand there. The chandeliers shimmered, the marble floors reflected the soft glow of candlelight, and a string quartet played near the stage, their notes floating over the murmur of hundreds of guests. Tables were covered in white silk roses, climbed tall crystal vases, and servers moved like clockwork with trays of champagne. It looked like a fairy tale, and all I could think was that I had paid $30,000 to create it. My retirement savings, 7 years of careful sacrifice, had been poured into this night for my younger sister, Emily. I clutched my silver clutch and walked toward my table near the stage. Guests swept past me, their laughter high and easy. Women in sequined gowns kissed cheeks, men in tailored suits clapped each other on the back. None of them looked at me. They raised their glasses, whispering Emily's name with admiration, as if she alone had built this cathedral of wealth. I tried to steady my breathing to remind myself why I had done it, hoping that tonight might mend something broken. Just one word of gratitude, I told myself. Just one. The lights shifted as the MC invited my father to speak. Charles, in his dark suit and polished shoes, walked confidently to the microphone. He smiled at the crowd, his voice steady, and began praising Emily. He said she had worked tirelessly to plan every detail that her strength and elegance had made this evening possible. He called her the pride of the family. I froze, waiting for my name, waiting for him to mention that I had signed every check, that I had given everything I could to make this happen. It never came. My fingers slipped. The champagne flute fell from my hand and shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp enough to cut through the applause. Heads turned. A woman across the table frowned as if I had broken the spell of the evening. A waiter rushed to sweep up the pieces, his eyes averted, his hands quick. I whispered an apology, my throat tight, and sat stiffly in my chair. The room closed in around me. My father kept talking as if nothing had happened. The guests clinked glasses, voices rising with laughter. My mother dabbed delicately at her eyes with a handkerchief, her smile stretched toward Emily at the head table. She glanced at me once, just long enough for me to see the cool disapproval in her eyes, before turning back to her favorite daughter. Emily lifted her glass, her diamond bracelet flashing under the lights. Her smile was wide, almost perfect, but when her eyes slid toward me, there was something else. It was the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth, a satisfaction that told me she knew exactly what had been taken from me. I tightened my jaw, heat burning under my skin, but I stayed silent. To protest would only make me look bitter. To speak would give them what they wanted. The applause swelled as my father concluded his speech, guests rising slightly in their seats to toast Emily once more. My mother leaned over to kiss her cheek, whispering something that made Emily laugh softly. I sat still, my hands clasped too tightly in my lap. Invisible. That was what I was in that ballroom. My savings had built the stage, but I had no place in the story being told. I told myself not to cry. Not here, not in front of them. But inside, something heavy shifted, and I knew this was not the first time I had been erased. It had always been this way from the very beginning. Sitting there with broken glass still glittering on the floor at my feet, I felt old memories stirring memories of other nights when I had been made to disappear. I realized I had seen this pattern long before tonight, and it had started years ago in a house where one daughter was always chosen and the other was expected to remain in the shadows. I was 12 the day I realized I would never come first. It was spring in Denver, and I had just won an academic award at school, a certificate for top marks in my class. I stood on stage in the auditorium, clutching the paper, scanning the crowd for my parents. The other kids' families waved proudly, snapping pictures, clapping loudly when their children's names were called. I kept waiting, telling myself maybe they were late, maybe they had gotten stuck in traffic. When the ceremony ended and the rows of families spilled into the hallway with flowers and balloons, I walked out alone. My parents had taken Emily to a pageant on the other side of town. She was 7 then, with a crown already perched on her curls. That memory stayed with me. The photos my teacher handed me afterward showed me smiling stiffly, my hair pinned neatly back, holding a certificate that no one at home ever mentioned. Later that evening, when I asked where they had been, my mother said Emily's competition was important. My father added that I was responsible enough to understand. I nodded, because that was what the older child was supposed to do, absorb disappointment quietly. At home, it was always Emily in the spotlight. In every framed photo on the living room wall, she was centered, her dresses colorful, her grin wide. If I was in the picture at all, I stood at the edge half cut off as though the camera had never meant to catch me. Family dinners followed the same script. Emily chattered about her day. My parents laughed and asked questions. And when I tried to share something from school, my father would wave me off with a reminder that the oldest has to set an example. My mother often told me to let Emily shine, to remember that sacrifice was a virtue. There were moments I tried to push back. Once in high school, after I brought home straight A's and an invitation to join an honors program, I asked if they were proud. My father barely looked up from his paper. He said that was expected from me, nothing extraordinary. Emily, sitting across the table, giggled about a dance rehearsal, and suddenly the conversation shifted to her costume. I felt the heat in my cheeks, the same ache I felt years later in that ballroom when my glass shattered on the floor. Even as I grew older, the pattern never changed. Emily always had their attention, their applause, their money when she needed it. I was the reliable one, the daughter they trusted to manage on her own, which really meant they barely saw me at all. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had done something wrong, if being quiet, bookish, and careful made me less deserving of love. The truth was, it had nothing to do with what I did. It had everything to do with the roles they had decided for us long ago. Emily was the chosen child, the one they wanted the world to see. I was the shadow, steady and unseen, called upon only when there was work to be done or a mess to clean up. I thought about all of this as I sat in the ballroom, applause still echoing in my ears. The humiliation I felt tonight was not new. It was the same wound reopened deeper this time, because I had given them everything and still been erased. I clenched my hands under the table, remembering how often they told me that sacrifice was my duty. I realized then that this wedding was not just a celebration for Emily. It was a declaration that the story had always belonged to her. What I did not know as I stared at Emily basking in the light was that my own sacrifice was about to reach a level I could never have imagined. The $30,000 I had spent was not just another forgotten gift. It was about to become the center of a betrayal so deliberate that it would change everything I thought I knew about family. When Emily announced she was getting married in the summer of 2022, I felt a spark of hope I had not allowed myself in years. She and her fiancé Nathan talked endlessly about the ceremony. They dreamed of the grand venue, the flowers, the music, and then sighed about how impossible it all was. They could not afford it. For the first time, I saw an opening, a chance to be more than the shadow, to do something so undeniable that my parents would have to see me. I told them I would cover the costs. $30,000 from my retirement account money I had guarded carefully for the future suddenly became their lifeline. Emily gasped and hugged me. Nathan thanked me awkwardly, and my mother simply said, that was what older sisters were supposed to do. I ignored the sting of her words and signed the contracts. The Broadmoor Resort, catering for 200 guests, live music, florists, photographers. My signature was on every line, my name tied to every deposit. As I walked out of the resort office that day, papers folded neatly in my purse, my eyes blurred with tears. Maybe this time would be different, I told myself. Maybe now, finally, they would acknowledge me. The illusion did not last long. A week later, I received the wedding invitation. The paper was thick and embossed with gold lettering, Emily's name and Nathan's printed in elegant script. I scanned every line, expecting at least a small note of gratitude, a mention of my role. Instead, I found myself listed only as a guest, the same as any distant relative or family friend. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the card, my chest hollow. I had given everything, and yet in their story, I did not even exist. That evening, I drove to my parents' house, hoping for reassurance, though I did not admit it to myself. I let myself in through the back door and paused in the kitchen when I heard their voices from the dining room. My father spoke first, his tone certain. After the wedding, the house and the family savings should all go to Emily. She was the one who deserved it. My mother murmured agreement. She said Emily was the future, the child they could count on to carry the family name. I pressed my back against the wall, breath shallow, my hands trembling. Every word cut deeper than the last. I left quietly before they saw me driving aimlessly through the streets of Denver until the sky went black. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily, a photo of her trying on a wedding dress, her smile radiant. She wrote that she could not wait for me to see her walk down the aisle. I stared at the screen, my throat tight, and for the first time I wondered if she even understood the price I had paid, or if she simply chose not to. The days that followed blurred together. I went through the motions at work, balancing ledgers at the small accounting firm I ran, answering emails, drinking too much coffee to mask the exhaustion. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard my father's voice again, declaring that Emily was the only one who mattered. I tried to convince myself that the money did not matter, that family was worth more. Yet at night, sitting alone in my quiet house, I replayed the moment I held that invitation in my hands and saw myself erased. I knew then this was not just neglect. It was deliberate. They had taken my sacrifice and turned it into proof of my insignificance. What I could not shake was the question of how far they were willing to go to keep me in the shadows. The answer began to surface in ways I did not expect, whispered to me first by people outside the family, people who had seen and heard things that made my stomach twist. That was when I realized the betrayal was larger than $30,000 and that others were already being pulled into the story without my knowledge. It started with a phone call from Hannah Scott, my old roommate from college, the one who used to share late-night pizza with me and laugh about how different our families were. Her voice was sharper than I remembered, rushed, as if she had been rehearsing. I tried to explain what had happened with the wedding, how I had covered the costs and still been written out, but she cut me off. She said I had always been too controlling, too critical, and that maybe it was better if I just showed up quietly and let Emily have her moment. The words sank into me like ice. I had reached out for comfort, and instead, she handed me judgment. The sting deepened a few days later when I scrolled through my phone and saw Hannah's new post on social media. A photo of Emily smiling in a bridal-fitting lace flowing across the mirror, the caption praising her for planning her wedding all by herself. Hundreds of likes, comments filled with admiration. Not a single word about me. My stomach twisted as I read it again and again, the truth so clear it made my hands shake. Even the people who had known me best were willing to erase me. That night I sat on my couch staring at the glow of my phone when a message popped up from Maggie Lopez, a nurse I had become close with through volunteer work at the hospital. She had always been straightforward, steady, someone who told the truth even when it was hard. Maggie warned me that whispers were spreading. My family was telling people that I had been meddling in the wedding plans, making things difficult, demanding control. I felt my chest tighten. She said some guests had already heard the story and were repeating it as fact. Soon the messages began arriving directly to me. Old acquaintances from church, a cousin I had not seen in years, even a colleague from my firm, each one asking in careful words if it was true that I had caused problems. I typed replies with shaking fingers, insisting it was not, but with each question I felt more isolated. My name was turning into a rumor, reshaped by people who wanted me silenced. The betrayal cut deeper because it came from every direction. My parents dismissed me. My sister smiled while I vanished, and now Hannah, the friend who had once held my secrets, stood on Emily's side. I walked through Denver's streets in the evenings, the city lights blurring, wondering how many more people believed the lies. One night, unable to sleep, I drove past Hannah's house. The living room lights glowed, and through the window, I saw her with Emily, laughing over a glass of wine. They were leaning close, their heads together, and Emily's hands moved animatedly as she spoke. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. That was when I knew Hannah had not just drifted away from me. She had chosen her side. When I returned home, the invitation card still lay on my counter. The gold letters shimmered under the kitchen light, beautiful and cruel at the same time. I thought of every rumor, every whisper, every look I had endured. My parents and Emily had erased me from their story, and now even my friends were helping them write me out. But I also remembered Maggie's words, her warning that this was spreading faster than I realized. I sensed that humiliation at the wedding would not be the end of it. Something was building, and soon I would see just how far they were willing to go to ensure I disappeared completely. The ballroom glowed with candlelight as I sat at my assigned table, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from trembling. David Clark, an old colleague from my accounting firm, leaned toward me and whispered how beautiful everything looked. I nodded, unable to tell him the truth, that the beauty around us had been bought with every dollar I had saved. I tried to focus on the music, the hum of conversation, the sparkle of glasses being raised, anything to quiet the storm inside me. The MC called my father to the stage. Charles walked with steady steps, his gray hair slicked back, his tuxedo pressed. He smiled at the crowd, lifted the microphone, and began his speech. He spoke of Emily's determination, her eye for detail, her ability to pull together such a grand event. The guests clapped politely, some nodding, as if they had always known she had this gift. I waited, my heart beating against my ribs, hoping for even one word about me. It never came. Instead, he ended by saying this wedding was the perfect reflection of Emily's strength and grace. A hollow laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. David glanced at me, startled, but before I could gather myself, my mother stood. Margaret's voice carried clearly across the room. She said she was proud of Emily and grateful the evening had gone so smoothly. Then her smile sharpened. She added that at least this time I had not ruined anything. For a moment, the air froze. Then a ripple of laughter broke out, hesitant and strained. Heads turned toward me, eyes filled with pity or amusement. I felt my face burn, my body stiffen, as if every bone had locked in place. David's mouth fell open. He whispered my name, but I could not answer. I stared at the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered pattern with my fingertip, wishing the ground would swallow me. My mother returned to her seat, satisfied, her hand resting on Emily's arm. Emily stood in her gown, pearls at her throat, eyes fixed on me with a gleam that left no doubt. She wanted me to see her triumph, to understand that this stage belonged only to her. The orchestra struck up another piece. Glasses clinked, conversation resumed, but the sound seemed distant, muffled, as though I were trapped underwater. I tried to breathe, tried to steady myself, but humiliation pressed down heavier than any weight I had ever carried. This was not a private slight. This was public execution, delivered by the people who should have defended me. I thought of the $30,000 of every check I had signed, of the contracts I had negotiated. None of it mattered now. My parents had erased me not just from their hearts, but from the eyes of every guest who witnessed their words. My throat ached with the effort of holding back tears. David reached for my hand under the table, a silent attempt at comfort, but I pulled away. Comfort would not erase what had been said. I sat there in the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by laughter and applause, while a hollow carved itself deeper inside me. I understood that I had been deliberately broken down, that my absence from their story had been planned. As the night progressed, the celebration grew louder and brighter, yet I felt smaller and colder. Every smile directed at Emily was another reminder of how thoroughly I had been cast aside. And as I watched my parents beam at her, as if nothing could have gone more perfectly, I realized something far darker waited beyond this night. The humiliation in that ballroom was only the beginning, and I was about to uncover just how deep their betrayal truly went. I returned home the morning after the wedding, and the silence in my house felt heavier than the ballroom had. The flowers on the counter were wilting remnants of arrangements I had paid for but never received credit for. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the unopened boxes from storage stacked in the corner. One box in particular caught my eye, the one I had taken when my grandmother June passed in 2018. I pulled it closer, dust rising as I slid off the lid. Inside were old photographs, a stack of letters tied with ribbon, and a thin envelope marked with my grandmother's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but clear. It was her will. My eyes traced the lines until they landed on the words that made my breath catch. She had written that her gold necklace with the jade pendant was to be given to me on my wedding day. I read the sentence 3 times, the letters blurring through tears. I could still see Emily the night before standing radiant in her gown, with that very necklace glinting at her throat. I remembered asking my mother about it years earlier. She had told me the clasp was broken, that the piece was too delicate to repair. She had said it casually, folding laundry as if it meant nothing. Now the truth pulsed before me. It had never been broken. It had been taken. My phone buzzed on the table, jolting me back. It was a message from Maggie. She asked if I had a moment to talk. When I called, her voice was low, cautious. She told me she had seen something while helping a friend organize legal files. It was a scanned document signed by my mother, a temporary loan agreement allowing Emily to borrow the necklace for the wedding. Maggie said she thought I needed to know before it disappeared. I asked her to send it. A moment later, the file lit up my screen. There was my mother's signature in sharp black ink, granting Emily permission to wear what had been promised to me. My stomach turned. It was not just favoritism. It was fraud, deliberate and calculated. I pressed the phone to my chest, staring at the will spread open on the table. The humiliation of being erased in public was brutal, but this cut deeper. This was my grandmother's voice, silenced and ignored, her last wish handed away as if it were nothing. I tried to imagine the conversations behind closed doors. My mother telling Emily that no one would notice. My father nodding, pretending it was justified. Emily smiling, clasping the necklace at her throat, knowing it was never hers. I folded the will carefully and placed it back in the envelope, but the anger inside me would not settle. It pressed at my ribs, hot and unrelenting. For years I had told myself I could live with being overlooked, that I could survive without their approval. But this was different. This was theft dressed up as tradition. The evening light faded across Denver shadows, stretching long against my walls. I sat at the table with the will and the scan glowing on my phone, the proof of everything I had felt, but never been able to show. My grandmother had trusted them, and they had betrayed her too. I closed my eyes and took a long breath, but the image of Emily at the altar with the necklace burned behind my eyelids. The betrayal was no longer a whisper. It was a fact written in ink and sealed by deceit. What I did not yet know was how powerful those papers would become, and how quickly they would force me to choose between silence and action. I carried the envelope and the printed copy of the scanned document in my bag as if they were too fragile to touch. The next morning, I made an appointment with Vincent Gray, a family law attorney in downtown Denver. His office was on the 15th floor of a glass building that overlooked the city, and my palms were damp by the time I stepped out of the elevator. I told myself to breathe, that I was only asking questions, but the truth was, I already knew why I had come. Vincent was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with silver at his temples and a steady calm in his eyes. He invited me to sit across from his desk, his shelves lined with thick casebooks, framed certificates, and a small photograph of his own family. I placed the documents on the polished wood surface and told him everything. The money I had spent, the humiliation at the wedding, the will my grandmother left, the false story about the broken clasp, and the temporary loan my mother had signed. He listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, and when I finished, his expression was firm. He said the will was valid and clear. The necklace belonged to me and should have been in my possession on my wedding day, not hanging around Emily's neck. He tapped the loan document with his pen and said this was more than favoritism. This was a violation of my grandmother's intent and of state inheritance law. My stomach churned as he leaned back in his chair. He told me plainly that I had grounds to sue, not only to reclaim the necklace, but also to seek damages for the financial and emotional harm. I stared at him, my throat dry. The thought of dragging my parents and sister into court made me feel sick. I imagined the gossip, the headlines in local papers, the whispers at church and in my neighborhood. Vincent seemed to sense my hesitation. He folded his hands and spoke gently but firmly. Silence, he said, would mean consent. If I allowed their actions to stand, then I would be accepting the humiliation they had inflicted. He reminded me that they had not only erased me, but had mocked me in front of 200 witnesses. The law, he said, was the only way to restore my dignity. I pressed my hands together, struggling to find words. I told him I was tired, that I had spent my whole life trying to be good enough, trying to prove myself, and now all I wanted was peace. He nodded, but did not relent. Peace, he said, would never come from surrender. It would come only when truth was recognized. Later that evening, I sat with Lucas in our living room, the papers spread out across the coffee table. The lamplight glowed on his face as he read every line carefully. When he looked up, his eyes met mine without wavering. He said I had given too much already, that I had been silent for too long. Then he reached for my hand and told me he would stand with me no matter what. The weight of his words broke something open inside me. For the first time since the wedding, I felt steady, anchored by his support. I thought of Maggie, who had risked herself to send me the file, and of my grandmother, whose handwriting still marked the will. I knew then this fight was no longer just mine. I gathered the documents back into the envelope, my hands no longer shaking. The decision had been made. I would not remain silent. I would not let their betrayal be the final word. What I did not yet realize was how public this battle would become, and how exposing the truth would ripple far beyond the walls of a courtroom. I laid the documents out across the dining table one by one, until the wood beneath them was barely visible. The receipts from the Broadmoor Resort, the catering invoices, the signed contracts with my name on every page, $30,000 accounted for, down to the last cent. Beside them, I placed my grandmother June's will, her handwriting trembling but clear, naming me as the rightful owner of the gold necklace with the jade pendant. And finally the copy Maggie had sent me, my mother's signature, scrawled across the loan form that had allowed Emily to parade in something that was never hers. The afternoon light slanted through the windows of my Denver home, painting long shadows across the floor. I sat with my elbows on the table, my hands pressed together under my chin, staring at the pile of proof. Each paper was a piece of my life, fragments of love and loyalty that had been twisted and stolen. My chest ached, but beneath the ache was a steadiness I had not felt before. I rose and walked to the cabinet where Lucas kept the lockbox. Together we found the folder thick and heavy and slid the evidence inside. When the lid snapped shut, the sound was final, like a door closing behind me. I was no longer the daughter who kept quiet. I was no longer the sister who gave and expected nothing in return. Lucas placed his hand on my shoulder. He did not need to speak. His presence was enough to remind me that I was not alone. I turned toward the window again. The city stretched beyond the glass, alive with the movement of cars and people heading home from work. Somewhere out there, Emily was probably posting another photo, basking in compliments, believing she had won. My parents were likely still congratulating themselves for putting me in my place. They had no idea what was coming. I traced my finger along the edge of the folder and imagined the courtroom, imagined their faces when the documents were read aloud. For once, they would not be able to dismiss me with a glance or a cruel joke. The truth would not be whispered in a kitchen or buried in a box. It would be spoken where everyone could hear it. The ache of betrayal was still there, sharp and raw, but it no longer hollowed me out. It sharpened me. I thought of my grandmother, of her steady voice telling me as a child that fairness mattered, that dignity could not be given away. I thought of Maggie risking herself to bring me the proof. I thought of Lucas choosing to stand with me. Their belief became the fire that steadied my resolve. I lifted the folder, felt its weight, and locked it away. Then I sat back down, letting the silence of the room wrap around me. For years I had been the shadow. Tonight I felt the first stirrings of something else. Not revenge for the sake of pain, but justice for the sake of truth. They had humiliated me in front of 200 guests. They had stolen my grandmother's promise. They had rewritten me out of their story. But the story was not finished. The next chapter would be mine to tell, and this time it would not be hidden in the dark. They had gone public with their cruelty. Now it was time for the truth to go public too. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you take them to court and let everyone see what they tried so hard to hide?